never would have imagined that a simple fishing weekend would turn into the worst experience of my life. It was supposed to be an escape from the usual chaos of work, just me and Dustin, my son. The plan was to spend a day in nature, enjoy the fresh air, the calm of the rivers, and maybe catch a few fish. But the peace I was looking for was lost in that moment when I turned my back for just a few minutes to check my work messages. That's when I noticed the silence, an unsettling silence, the kind that makes your heart beat faster, as if you already know something is very wrong. I turned my head, looked around, calling out to him, "Dustin." The first time it was calm, almost casual. But when he didn't answer, the anxiety began to set in. His name came out of my mouth, louder and louder, more and more urgent. But the forest around me responded only with the sound of the wind and the rustling of the leaves. From that moment on, everything blurred. I ran along the trail, turning over every rock, running my hands through bushes, as if he could be hiding in any of those recesses. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. The sun was already starting to hide between the trees, and the idea of losing daylight made me even more desperate. With each step, the anguish grew. I, Fred Blake, a successful businessman with everything in my life under control, was now on my knees in the forest, disoriented and helpless, searching for my son. I was already exhausted, my body ached, and my mind was spinning with 1,000 dark thoughts, but continuing to walk was the only option. That was when, almost by chance, I spotted a small rustic building, almost invisible among the trees. A cabin. I approached it cautiously, my heart racing with a mixture of hope and fear. What if Dustin is in there? Xerenia, what if he is? I was a few meters from the cabin when I heard rough male voices talking inside. I hid behind some bushes, holding my breath, trying to make sense of what they were saying. "What do you think, Robert? Should we get our share of the inheritance soon?" one of the voices said, chuckling softly. Inheritance? What the hell was that? And why would my son be involved with these men? "Well, that's up to the mistress," the other replied. It was her idea after all. I was tense, my muscles tensing. I had no idea who these people were or what they were up to, but I knew it was dangerous. Then the door creaked, and they came out. I stood frozen, watching them. Two burly, dirty men in camouflage. One of them had a rifle slung over his shoulder. "We're going hunting now, Tyrone," the man named Robert muttered. "She'll be sleeping for another 3 or 4 hours." I was shocked. Sleeping? Who were they keeping inside? They both disappeared into the woods, and I took a deep breath, realizing that I might have a chance of getting into the cabin unnoticed. I waited a moment until I was sure they were far away. Then, with my heart pounding so hard, I could almost hear it echoing in my head, I walked slowly to the half-open door. I held my breath as I crept through the cabin door. The old, damp wood creaked beneath my feet as I looked around, trying to make sense of what was going on inside. The interior was dark, with makeshift furniture and a heavy feeling in the air. In the corner, on a dirty mattress, lay a young woman. She seemed to be sleeping soundly, but something about the paleness of her face and the fragility of her posture told me that this was no ordinary sleep. I slowly approached and touched her arm. It was cold. "Hey," I murmured, shaking her gently, hoping she would wake up. No response. She was young, barely in her 20s. Something about her seemed out of place, as if she didn't belong in this cabin or in the company of these men. I noticed her chest rising and falling slowly, so at least she was breathing, but she still seemed to be under the influence of something, some kind of sedative. What the hell had those men done to her? I realized I had to get her out of there. and fast. But as I picked her up, a cold pain crawled down my spine. Dustin. He was still out there, lost somewhere in the woods. Part of me wanted to drop everything, leave this stranger behind, and run to find my son. But another part of me knew that if I left her here, she would probably never escape. I bent down and picked her up, her body limp and lifeless. Each step toward the exit felt heavier, a reminder that I didn't know what I would find out there. Don't give up, Dustin, I thought. I'll find you one way or another. But first, I had to get this girl out of the cabin and make sure those men wouldn't hurt her again. I had barely left the cabin, carrying the young girl in my arms, when I heard distant voices among the trees. My heart was racing. The men were coming back. I could feel the urgency building inside me, almost as palpable as the weight of the unconscious body I was holding. I looked around, searching for a place to hide or an escape route. The forest around us was dense, but dusk was already setting in, making the shadows longer and the surroundings even darker. I took a deep breath and began to move as quickly as I could, without making a sound. Every leaf I stepped on seemed to amplify the sound of my footsteps. Why did I get myself into this? I thought, feeling the pressure of each decision crush me. My son was still missing, and I was helping a complete stranger. But abandoning someone to an uncertain fate, that wasn't an option. Suddenly, I heard a laugh coming from the direction of the cabin, followed by a groan and the sound of heavy footsteps. Those two hunters came back sooner than I expected, I thought, my heart pounding so loudly I could swear they could hear it. I ducked behind a tree, holding my breath, as one of them mumbled something about a lost deer. I waited until the sound of footsteps faded, but I knew I didn't have much time. Taking advantage of the moment of silence, I got up and followed a narrow trail that stretched between the trees. The darkness was growing, and I knew that soon it would be almost impossible to see the path. Each step was a struggle, both against the weight I carried and against the fear that these men would follow us. My arms were shaking, sweat was running down my face, and fatigue was starting to weigh me down. But the thing that made me sick to my stomach the most was the uncertainty. With every passing second, Dustin could be getting further away, and the thought of losing my son in the darkness of the forest was something I simply couldn't accept. The young woman in my arms began to stir slightly, mumbling something inaudibly, but she didn't open her eyes. Her weight became harder to bear with each step, and my body felt ready to collapse. But one thought kept me going. This was the only chance I had to save someone that night. Even if it meant leaving Dustin for just a moment longer, I had to make sure that at least one life would make it out of these woods safely. So I kept going, braving the darkness, praying that I would find a way out before the hunters or the night closed the way. The forest was becoming increasingly oppressive. I kept walking, the muscles in my legs and arms already screaming in pain, but something inside me told me that I had to keep going. That was when I heard the snap of a dry twig, very close to where I was. My body froze. I hid behind a tree, still holding the young stranger, trying to make as little noise as possible. I waited, my eyes fixed on the darkness in front of me, my heart beating wildly in my chest. Another snap, this time followed by a low growl. Wolves, I thought, fear filling me. I had seen enough documentaries to know that the chance of getting out of there unharmed was slim. But to my surprise, the sound changed to a calm, hoarse voice, speaking from the shadows. Don't be afraid. He won't hurt you. Emerging from the darkness was a tall old man with a long gray beard and a piercing gaze. Beside him, a huge dog, its fur as black as night itself, watched me with attentive eyes. Who are you? I asked, my voice almost shaking. The strangeness and the relief of not being a wild predator mixed within me. The man smiled slightly, serenely. "My name is Gary Garner. This is Cooper." He pointed to the dog, who kept his gaze fixed on me. "You must be Fred, right?" How did he know my name? I was completely confused. Apparently the man had sensed my hesitation and continued, "I've been looking for you, or rather, for your son." A wave of hope mixed with disbelief washed over me. "Dustin, did you find him?" The words came out in a whisper, filled with an urgency I could barely control. Gary nodded slowly, his gaze filled with compassion. "Yes, he's safe. But it seems he sprained his ankle. I took him to my cabin nearby. He's resting." At that moment, a mixture of relief and gratitude washed over me, and my legs nearly gave way under the weight of exhaustion and emotion. After hours of searching and despair, knowing that my son was safe was more than I could ask for. "Thank you," I managed, my voice breaking. Gary nodded slightly, as if he understood exactly what that meant to me. But then he looked down at the unconscious young woman in my arms, his expression growing more serious. "And who is this Fred? Did you meet anyone along the way?" I quickly explained what had happened from the moment I had heard the voices at the cabin until her rescue. He nodded thoughtfully. "These men you met, they're poachers, and they use the forest for their own tricks. It seems you've discovered something they'd rather keep hidden." Still reeling from the tension, I shook my head. She was there, unconscious, and I couldn't leave her. "But now, please take me to Dustin." Gary smiled and gestured for me to follow him. We walked toward his cabin, Cooper trotting ahead of us, as if guarding the path. With each step, the weight of the young woman seemed to lessen in my arms, and a strange sense of security settled over me. Gary led us through the forest, with firm, purposeful steps, as if every tree, every rock, every curve was familiar to him. I followed, still carrying the young woman, while my mind torn between relief at finally finding Dustin and uneasinesses about what it all meant. The cabin, the men talking about inheritance, the sedated young woman in the middle of the forest. After a few minutes of walking, we arrived at a small, rustic cabin, different from the one I had found. Cooper the dog was the first to enter, and soon after, Gary motioned for me to follow him. As soon as I entered, my gaze went straight to a bed in the corner, where I saw a little blonde head resting. "Dustin," I whispered, almost afraid to break the moment. I placed the young woman on a nearby chair and knelt beside the bed. There he was, my son, with a serene face and a lightly bandaged leg. He opened his eyes slowly, and when he saw me, a smile appeared on his face. "Dad." Emotion overcame me, and for a moment, nothing else in the world mattered. I hugged him carefully, trying not to put pressure on his injured ankle. "You scared me so much, kid," I murmured, feeling a stubborn tear run down my face. "Sorry, Dad. I just went exploring a little. I got lost," he replied, his voice half drowsy, but full of regret. Gary came over, watching us with a calm smile. "He's okay now, Fred. Just a little scare and a sprained ankle. He needs some rest." I turned to Gary, trying to find the words to thank him, but I was interrupted by a movement from the young woman I had rescued. She opened her eyes, confused, as if coming out of a nightmare, and looked around, first at me, then at Gary, and finally at Dustin. Her eyes were filled with uncertainty and fear, and I could tell she barely knew where she was. "You're safe now," I murmured, trying to calm her. "My name is Fred, and this is Gary. He helped us. And this is my son, Dustin." She blinked a few times, as if trying to remember something. "My name is Jennifer," she said weakly. "I don't know exactly what happened. I just remember a conversation and someone offering me some tea. Then everything went black." I turned to Gary, trying to process what she had said. The image of the poachers flashed through my mind. They were talking about an inheritance, something to do with a boss. I glanced at Jennifer, and she seemed lost in thought, trying to piece together the slowly emerging memories. "These men," I asked, my voice low and cautious, "they were talking about an inheritance. Does that make any sense to you?" Jennifer frowned and nodded slowly. "Yes, I think so. They mentioned my husband, William." She paused, her eyes filling with tears. He wanted me to sign some documents about an inheritance, but it didn't make sense. My father passed away a year ago, and I thought everything was already settled." A shiver ran down my spine. "William?" I asked incredulously. "Your last name is Miller?" She nodded, confused by my reaction. And in that instant, the puzzle began to come together in my mind. William Miller, my longtime rival, the man who had challenged me in every aspect of my life, was somehow involved in this. Suddenly, everything made sense. The conversation at the cabin, the dark plan, and even Dustin's disappearance seemed more than just a coincidence. Jennifer looked at me, vulnerability etched on her face. "Do you know my husband?" I swallowed, realizing that this was something much bigger than a simple business dispute. "Yes, I do. And I have a feeling he's behind all of this, somehow." Gary's gaze flicked from Jennifer to me, his expression one of silent understanding. He watched me as if he already knew what I had to do next. I needed to understand the full extent of this dark plan, and more than that, protect my son and this woman who, until recently, had been a complete stranger. I stood up, determination rising within me. It was time to face William and settle this once and for all. I knew what I had to do. William had always been ambitious, but I had never imagined he would be capable of something so foul. The hatred and pain I had felt for him over the years now seemed like shadows compared to the real threat he posed. This was no longer just a feud between business rivals. He had put lives in danger. After thanking Gary and leaving Dustin in his care, I decided that Jennifer and I would confront William together. As we walked down the trail back to my car, we exchanged few words, both of us deep in thought. She looked exhausted, still shaken by everything that had happened. I could see the pain in her eyes, but also a spark of determination. She wanted answers as much as I did. By the time we reached town, dusk was already turning into night, and a dark anxiety was creeping in on me. I called the police and explained the situation, but I couldn't expect them to solve everything in time. I needed to confront William in person. It was clear that what he had done was not only a betrayal of Jennifer, but a threat to my own family. We stopped in front of Jennifer's mansion, and my stomach turned when I saw the lights on inside. Taking a deep breath, I motioned for Jennifer to stay behind me as we quietly entered through the front door, which was open as if someone had been expecting us. The room was eerily quiet, but as soon as we crossed the main hallway, I caught sight of William sitting on the couch next to Miriam, my wife. The sight hit me like a punch. She was standing next to him, her hand resting on William's shoulder, as if they were accomplices, as if she knew everything and agreed. "Miriam, what are you doing here?" My voice was low, choked with anger and disappointment. She just smiled, a cold smile I had never seen before. And then William stood up, stepping forward with a triumphant look. "It seems you finally understand, Fred. While you were there playing the successful businessman, I was building something bigger. something you can never destroy. My blood boiled, but I forced myself to remain calm. "You've involved my family, William? This has gone too far." He laughed, a laugh that echoed through the room with a menacing tone. "And what are you going to do, Fred? Now you have nothing. Jennifer's inheritance, the company, even your own wife. They're all in my hands." I looked at Miriam, trying to understand how she could be involved in this. So many memories flashed through my head. Moments we'd shared, promises we'd made, and here she was, on the other side, next to the man who had always despised me. "Why?" I murmured, feeling a lump form in my throat. "Why, Miriam?" She looked away for a moment, but soon regained control and answered coldly, "You never loved me the way I deserved. I was just an addition to your perfect life, Fred." Anger finally took over me, and I stepped forward, but William held up his hand, as if he had been prepared for it. "Be careful, Fred. I still have many tricks up my sleeve." It was at that moment that Jennifer stepped forward, her voice firm and resolute. "This ends now, William. You will answer for everything you've done." He looked at her with contempt, but something in his posture changed. Maybe it was the fact that the police, whom I had discreetly called, were approaching the mansion, and he knew the noose was closing in. Within minutes, the red and blue lights of the squad cars filled the street, and the officers entered the mansion, handcuffing William and Miriam. As they were led away, a heavy silence fell over the place. Jennifer stood beside me, visibly exhausted, but confident. She had been through so much, and yet she showed a strength I hadn't anticipated. I looked at her and sighed, feeling relief mixed with sadness. "I think this is over," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you, Fred. You saved me in so many ways." I felt a deep connection with Jennifer, something that went beyond any friendship or obligation. Our shared experience, our struggle to survive, and our confrontation with our pasts had brought us closer in an inexplicable way. In the days that followed, I made a point of supporting Jennifer as she rebuilt her life and regained control over her inheritance. Dustin, happy and secure, seemed to gel with her, and I soon realized that Jennifer was becoming a constant and welcoming presence in our lives. Our bond deepened, and before we knew it, we found ourselves building something more, something neither of us could have foreseen. The forest, with all its dangers and mysteries, had revealed to us not only the dark secrets of others, but also the strength and courage that lay within us. Night had fallen when I finally returned home, alone. I looked around, taking in the empty space where so many memories had been embedded in the walls, the furniture, the silence that now felt heavier than ever. This place, which I had once considered a refuge, was now a reminder of everything that had changed. Miriam was trapped, and I still struggled to understand how she could have been part of something so dark. It wasn't just her betrayal that struck me, but the idea that everything we had built together had somehow been corrupted. At the same time, something inside me felt free. As painful as it was to admit, Miriam and I had been estranged for some time. And Jennifer, with her strength, courage, and vulnerability, became an unexpected light amidst the chaos. In the days that followed, we stayed in touch. I helped her sort out the remaining legal issues surrounding her father's inheritance and the tangles William had created to take her assets. Little by little, she began to recover, and our friendship deepened in ways I never expected. Dustin, for his part, seemed enchanted by Jennifer. Seeing them together, laughing and exploring the world as if it were all one big adventure, brought me a genuine joy that I had lost. Each day, This tragedy that had begun as a desperate search for my son in the woods became a kind of rebirth for all of us. One morning, while we were having coffee, Dustin looked at me with that curious, direct look that only children can have. "Daddy, do you like Jennifer?" he asked with a mischievous smile, as if he knew more than he was saying. I felt a little embarrassed, but I answered honestly, "Yes, son, I like her. She is a very special person." He smiled, satisfied with the answer, and went back to eating his cereal. That got me thinking. Maybe, somehow, everything we had been through in those woods, the fear, the despair, the fight for survival, had brought us together in a way that only extreme experiences can. And deep down, I realized that I no longer wanted to run away from that feeling. Jennifer had become a part of my life, and something inside me told me that we were just getting started. A few months later, Jennifer and I decided to try something more. It was a natural step, but still a challenging one. Building a new life after so much suffering was a risk, but I knew it would be worth it. Little by little, our house stopped being a space filled with painful memories and became a home for new ones, filled with laughter, late-night conversations, and the sound of Dustin and Jennifer playing. I realized that the woods, with their mysteries and dangers, had shown me more than I had imagined. They taught me to cherish each moment, to recognize true courage, and most of all, to not be afraid to start over.